If you think you've heard dark prison stories before, wait until you hear this one. Before you dive in, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me which maximum security prison terrifies you the most. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end of this one. Now, let's get into it. October 22nd, 1983. USP Marion, Illinois, the most secure federal prison in America. A place designed to contain the absolute worst of the worst. Inside those concrete walls, surrounded by razor wire and armed guards, the federal government believed they had finally created the perfect cage. They were wrong. Correctional Officer Merle Klutz walked down the narrow corridor of H Unit that morning like he had done 1,000 times before. 40 years old, married with children, Klutz was a good man doing an impossible job. He was escorting an inmate named Thomas Silverstein to the shower. Standard procedure. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another day in America's toughest prison. But Thomas Silverstein was not an ordinary inmate. At 5'10", with piercing blue eyes and a calm demeanor that unsettled even seasoned guards, Silverstein had already murdered 2 men inside federal prisons. He was serving multiple life sentences. He had nothing to lose, nothing to fear, and everything to prove. The Aryan Brotherhood, the most dangerous white supremacist prison gang in America, owned his loyalty, and they had given him an order: kill Officer Klutz. The corridor was quiet that morning. Too quiet. Klutz led Silverstein down the hallway, both men's footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Other inmates watched from their cells, their eyes following the pair like vultures circling prey. They knew something Klutz didn't. Something terrible was about to happen. Silverstein's hands were supposed to be cuffed. They weren't. Another inmate had unlocked them moments earlier. Klutz had no idea that the man walking behind him was now free, now armed, now ready to kill. They were halfway down the corridor when Silverstein made his move. The attack was sudden, brutal, and efficient. Klutz never had a chance. Silverstein struck him from behind, driving the blade deep into his back. Once, twice, 3 times. Klutz stumbled forward, trying to call for help, trying to defend himself, trying to understand what was happening. But Silverstein didn't stop. 40 times. That's how many times Thomas Silverstein stabbed Merle Klutz. Even after Klutz collapsed to the ground, bleeding and dying, Silverstein continued the assault. It wasn't just murder. It was a message. Other guards heard the commotion and came running. By the time they reached the scene, it was too late. Officer Merle Klutz lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. Standing over his body, covered in blood, completely calm, was Thomas Silverstein. He didn't run. He didn't resist. "He's dead," Silverstein said flatly. No emotion, no remorse. The prison erupted into chaos. Alarms blared. Lockdown protocols activated. But the damage was done. A correctional officer, a federal employee, a husband and father, was dead, murdered in cold blood inside what was supposed to be America's most secure prison. The investigation revealed something chilling. This wasn't random violence. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with military precision. The Aryan Brotherhood had ordered the hit. Multiple inmates were involved. It was a conspiracy to murder a federal officer. But why? The answer was simple and terrifying. Klutz was doing his job too well. He was enforcing the rules, maintaining order. To the gang, he was an obstacle. To Silverstein, he was a target. As investigators examined Silverstein's background, they uncovered a pattern of violence that was almost incomprehensible. Born in 1952, raised by a mother connected to organized crime, Silverstein had been destined for this life. By 1980, he had committed his first prison murder. 1 year later, he killed again. 2 life sentences. But prison sentences meant nothing to him. That question haunted federal prison officials. How do you punish a man who's already serving multiple life sentences? The answer, they thought, was USP Marion, the end of the line for America's most dangerous criminals. They were wrong, because Thomas Silverstein had just proved that even America's toughest prison couldn't contain him. And as investigators stood in that blood-stained corridor, they realized something terrifying. They had nowhere left to send him. No prison secure enough. No system capable of containing a man who would kill without hesitation, without remorse, without fear of consequences. Thomas Silverstein had just declared war on the entire federal prison system. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The blood on the floor of H Unit was still fresh when federal investigators made a discovery that turned their investigation upside down. Thomas Silverstein wasn't the only killer that day. Just hours after Merle Klutz was murdered, another correctional officer at USP Marion was attacked. Officer Robert Hoffman was stabbed 29 times by Clayton Fountain, the same inmate who had unlocked Silverstein's handcuffs. Hoffman survived, but barely. 2 coordinated attacks. 2 Aryan Brotherhood members. One message: we can strike anywhere, anytime, and you can't stop us. USP Marion went into permanent lockdown that afternoon. Every inmate was confined to their cells 23 hours a day. Visits were restricted. Recreation was canceled. The entire facility became a concrete tomb. It was the birth of the modern Supermax prison, and Thomas Silverstein was the reason it existed. But what do you do with the man who created the problem? Where do you put someone who's already in the most secure prison in America? The Bureau of Prisons faced an unprecedented crisis. They couldn't execute Silverstein. Capital punishment for federal crimes required specific circumstances that didn't apply. They couldn't release him. He was serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. They couldn't send him to another prison because every facility in the system was terrified of taking him. Warden after warden refused. "Not here," they said. "We can't handle him. We won't risk our officers." So the Bureau of Prisons did something they had never done before. They created a prison within a prison, a cell designed specifically for one man. Thomas Silverstein became the most isolated prisoner in American history. They moved him to a special underground unit, a cell with no windows, no natural light, no human contact. The walls were solid concrete. The door was solid steel. Guards communicated with him through intercoms. Food was delivered through a slot. He was allowed out of his cell for 1 hour per day, alone, in a concrete recreation box that was only slightly larger than his cell. No sky, no sun, no contact with another living soul. Silverstein later described it as living in a tomb. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. He lost track of time. He forgot what the sun felt like. He couldn't remember the last time he had touched another human being or had a face-to-face conversation. The isolation was so complete, so total, that psychologists who studied his case said it bordered on torture. But here's what made Thomas Silverstein different from other inmates in solitary confinement. He adapted. While other prisoners went insane, screaming at walls and deteriorating mentally, Silverstein found ways to survive. He started painting, using materials provided through careful security protocols. He created artwork depicting nature, landscapes, and scenes of freedom he would never experience again. Some of his paintings were surprisingly beautiful, created by a man who had seen nothing but concrete for years. He also started writing letters to family, to lawyers, to human rights organizations. In his writings, Silverstein began to change. The cold-blooded killer, who had murdered 3 men, started to reflect on his actions. He expressed regret for the pain he caused Officer Klutz's family. He questioned the system that created men like him. He argued that extreme isolation was cruel and unusual punishment. Human rights groups agreed. Amnesty International called Silverstein's confinement inhumane. The ACLU filed lawsuits on his behalf. Medical experts testified that prolonged solitary confinement causes permanent psychological damage. But the Bureau of Prisons wouldn't budge. As long as Thomas Silverstein was alive, he would remain isolated. Years passed. 5 years. 10 years. 20 years. Silverstein was moved from prison to prison, always in isolation, always alone. He became a ghost in the system. Most correctional officers had never seen him. New guards heard stories about the most dangerous inmate in federal custody, but few had ever laid eyes on him. And then, in 1994, the federal government opened a new facility in Colorado, the Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a supermax prison designed with one purpose: to house inmates like Thomas Silverstein, men too dangerous for any other facility, men who had proven they would kill even while serving life sentences. The design of ADX Florence incorporated every lesson learned from Silverstein's decades of violence. Soundproof cells to prevent communication between inmates, remote control doors operated from secure control rooms, pressure-sensitive floors that detected movement, laser beams, and attack dogs patrolling the perimeter. It was a fortress designed to contain the unconfinable. Thomas Silverstein was transferred to ADX Florence, where he would spend the rest of his life. His cell was 7 feet by 12 feet. He had a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, and a small window that showed only sky. He couldn't see other buildings, couldn't see the ground, couldn't see anything that would orient him to where he was in the world. But something unexpected happened in those final years. Thomas Silverstein, the man who had murdered without remorse, began to speak out against the very system he had helped create. Chapter 3. The Legacy of a Killer, 750 Words. Thomas Silverstein's transformation behind the walls of ADX Florence became one of the strangest chapters in American prison history. The man who had once stabbed a correctional officer 40 times now spent his days writing essays about prison reform. The killer who had shown no mercy was now arguing that the conditions he lived under were worse than death itself. But was it genuine remorse, or was it the calculated manipulation of a psychopath who had decades to perfect his act? Prison psychologists couldn't agree. Some believed Silverstein had genuinely changed, that for decades of complete isolation had forced him to confront the monster he had become. Others argued he was doing what he had always done, playing a game, manipulating the system, trying to find any angle that might improve his conditions. Inside ADX Florence, Silverstein's neighbors were a rogues gallery of America's most notorious criminals. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was in the cell block. So was Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Terry Nichols from the Oklahoma City bombing. Zacharias Moussaoui, the 20th hijacker from September 11th. These were men who had terrorized the nation. Thomas Silverstein fit right in. But even among these monsters, Silverstein held a unique position. He was the reason ADX Florence existed. Every security protocol, every isolation procedure, every concrete wall and steel door was designed with one question in mind: how we prevent another Thomas Silverstein. Prison architects studied his case like generals studying a military defeat. What went wrong at Leavenworth? What failed at Marion? How do we build a facility that can contain someone who will kill without hesitation? The answer was ADX Florence, and it worked. During his years at the Supermax facility, Silverstein never killed again. He never attacked another guard. The system had finally found a way to neutralize him, but the cost was staggering. It cost approximately $60,000 per year to house an inmate at ADX Florence, nearly 3 times the cost of a regular federal prison. Multiply that by the decade Silverstein spent there, and the price tag reached into the millions. But the real cost couldn't be measured in dollars. The real cost was a question that haunted everyone. At what point does punishment become torture? Silverstein spent 36 consecutive years in solitary confinement. Think about that number. 36 years. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, alone in a concrete box. No physical contact with another human being. No conversation except through intercoms. No view except a small window, showing only empty sky. The psychological effects were devastating. Silverstein reported hallucinations, memory problems, and difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination. He forgot what his own voice sounded like in normal conversation. His sense of time became completely distorted. This was a man being slowly erased by isolation. But here's the part that divided public opinion. Did he deserve it? Officer Merle, Klutz never got to see his children grow up. Danny Atwell never got a second chance at life. Robert Chappelle's family never got closure. Should society show mercy to a man who showed none to his victims? In his later interviews, Silverstein tried to answer that question himself. He acknowledged his crimes. He admitted he was a killer. He accepted that he would die in prison. But he argued that no human being, regardless of their crimes, should be subjected to the kind of isolation he endured. He became an unlikely advocate for prison reform. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who made ADX Florence necessary was now arguing it shouldn't exist. May 11, 2019. St. Anthony Hospital in Lakewood, Colorado. Thomas Silverstein was rushed there from ADX Florence with heart complications. At 67 years old, after decades of isolation and deteriorating health, his body was finally giving out. He underwent surgery, but the damage was too severe. He died that afternoon, alone, surrounded by guards and medical staff, but no family, no friends, no one who cared whether he lived or died. It was a lonely end to a lonely life. The man who had spent more time in solitary confinement than anyone in American history died the same way he had lived for 4 decades, isolated, separated, alone. News of his death barely made headlines. For a man who had changed the entire American prison system, his passing was remarkably quiet, but his legacy lived on in concrete and steel. ADX Florence is still operating today, still housing America's most dangerous criminals, still using the protocols developed specifically because of Thomas Silverstein. Every soundproof cell, every remote-controlled door, every isolation procedure exists because one man proved that even maximum security wasn't enough. Prison reform advocates still cite Silverstein's case when arguing against prolonged solitary confinement. The United Nations has called such practices torture. But corrections officials counter with a simple question. What's the alternative? How do you handle someone who has killed 3 people while already serving life in prison? Thomas Silverstein never answered that question satisfactorily. He argued against the system that contained him, but he never offered a viable solution for dealing with inmates like himself. He wanted mercy he never showed others. In the end, Thomas Silverstein's story isn't just about one violent man. It's about the impossible balance between punishment and cruelty, between justice and revenge, between protecting society and preserving human dignity. ADX Florence stands today as Thomas Silverstein's monument, a concrete testament to what happens when violence meets the limits of containment. The man who made ADX Florence necessary is gone, but the prison he created lives on. If this story left you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and punishment, hit that subscribe button, because the next story will show you that Silverstein wasn't the end. He was just the beginning. Drop a comment and tell me, where's the line between justice and cruelty? I'll see you in the next one.